The history of violence in cinema is the history of cinema itself. Pioneering short films like The Great Train Robbery at the turn of the century featured fast-paced gunfights, breakneck horse chases, and old-fashioned beatdowns, a mix of Western masculine bravado and stylistic action that would define the violent films of the following decades, giving way to the Hays Codes of the 30s, the industry's self-censorship over any and all violence and racy projected images, not limited to sex, profanity, and drug use. By the end of the 60s, its iron grip on the industry would loosen, and the cinematic world would be ushered into a new period of expressionistic violence, from filmmakers uninhibited in their pursuit of radical visual art that stretched the limits of violence as a form of aesthetic, from Bonnie and Clyde to A Clockwork Orange to Taxi Driver, from These Guys. It would take another 20 years or so before these violent explorations on class, social disorder, and moral decay were taken to arguably even greater extremes by Tarantino, where cinematic violence wasn't just reinvented, it exploded. Where the horror, action, and traditional Hollywood dramas embodied ritualistic violence, the banal and easily predictable, Tarantino's violence reached an entirely new register, a genre of cinematic sadism that transports us to the domain of the hyperreal, where violence is not only removed from consequence, it's commonplace, the universal language that demands control over our senses, a violence elevated from the lowbrow levels of the ritualistic into the stratum of the avant-garde, a violence that is aesthetically beautiful. From the exhilarating violence released in the throes of climactic narrative action sequences, the spectacle of violence brought to screen, to the contemplative violence of slow methodology, the macabre fascination with violence as a gateway into our most primal instincts and affectations, Tarantino's violence rides the broad spectrum of engrossing visual entertainment. There's violence that lingers and gets under your skin, violence that's drawn out to horrifying lengths, too compelling to look away, the violence of narrative consequence. Then there's the black comedy of violence, humor found in the harrowing, violence accompanied by nail-biting wit, simulated violence for cheap laughs and the thrill of it all, violence messy, absurdist, slapstick in its presentation, brutality for brutality's sake, the violence of blondes and brides and bastards. Then there's pulpy violence, violence detached from the real world, a violence derived from its namesake that at its extremes produced just as lurid, exploitative, and sensational kinds of violence, not realistic violence, but an abstraction, a violence we're free to indulge in. The violence of being pulled into the criminal world of characters on the fringes, the violence of outcasts and figures removed from justice or morality, violence with no remorse, the violence that comes with staring down the barrel of a gun not knowing if it'll be the last thing you ever see, the fight scene, perhaps the single greatest synthesis of violence as an artistic exercise, the human flesh contending with its own mortality, violence as a director's imposed stylistic will, carrying more truth about our characters than a conversation ever could, the violence of implied origin stories, the violence that hardened our heroes and villains into the distraught dregs of society we know them as today. There's violence that's a commentary on the artifice that's always existed in the medium, a violence we might regard as excessive and careless in its devaluing of the flesh, violence responsible for the pollution of representational imagery, shallow, nihilistic, gratuitous violence, violence his critics levy as empty of social consequence, it's violence that's nothing new. In fact, it's violence derived from the long tradition of cinematic violence that came before, the grand melting pot of inspirations and influences Tarantino is enthralled by. Modern movie violence that can't help but be self-referential, the violence from old samurai movies or spaghetti westerns, the horrors that honor-bound men unleash upon the world, the violence found in patriarchal power and domination, to the violence of the film noir, filmmakers obsessed with the psychology of violence, the paranoia of a violence-obsessed society, violent acts which portrayed under the cover of visually evocative lighting and staging are rendered more beautifully than they have any business really being. There's systemic violence found in our country's greatest horrors, commodified, sensationalized extensions of the language of violence, and the violence found in language, the misogyny, homophobia, and racism his characters retch forth, the stylistic cynicism, the witty wordplay, the tough guy vernacular, all symptomatic of a violence that comes coupled with cruelty, violence our cultural lexicon has been forever transformed by. Then there's violence in the temporal that shapes our relationship to time, the violence of being thrashed through mixed chronologies, violence that leaks from one story into the next, the aching nostalgia his violence gives us access to, the violence contained in a cinematic lens powerful enough to change the course of events as we know them, replacing the violence that was with the violence that could have been, the violence of retribution our deepest fantasies yearn for, a violence that begs for a profound connection to narrative and meaning, a violence we can explain, the violence that concludes his narratives in dramatic fashion, the violence like fire and powder consumes, the violence that is inevitable to us, indifferent to us, indispensable, the violence that's perverse and pleasurable, violence loathsome in its own deliciousness, violence that invents peculiar tastes, violence that'll never satiate, stomach-bound violence, the stomach-churning violence we overindulge in, violence that confounds our appetites, it's violence we're thrilled and delighted by until we meet our violent end, violence that above all else, in cinema, rends. Mind Theater is a solo effort produced and written by me, Eo Akingbade. For only $3 a month, you can support the show on Patreon. It really helps a lot. The link is in the description box below. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.